what up? What up? It's kayfabe all day, and I just want to talk a little bit about the pro wrestling industry, Vince McMahon's effect on it, and whether or not Vince was good for pro wrestling. Now, people rewrite history, right, as time goes on, and what I've noticed is a lot of hardcore wrestling fans changed their views on Vince as time went on. And when I was watching wrestling in the 80s, growing up as a fan, started watching early 83, a lot of the hardcore fans, most of them knew that Vince wasn't good for business, that this national expansion of Vince was going to destroy the business as we knew it. And people will say, well, look, Vince did a lot for the business. Look how much money he was making guys. But really, it was only a few guys. Like, if you look at pro wrestling during the territory days, more guys were making a living off of it. You had hundreds of wrestlers, and they were able to have a long career. If they were top or even mid or upper card guy, even maybe mid card, they could sustain their whole career going from territory to territory without ever getting overused or exposed, right? They were able to do that. And you had variety, you had mystique about the business, better storylines, better angles, a fresher product, because again, you could move wrestlers could move around without getting too stale. And even though the travel was rough, you don't hear a lot about wrestlers from the territory era, except like in the 80s you do, right? That was like the end of the territory era, mid 80s. But you don't hear guys from those eras having like dying young and these overdoses and steroid fueled rages, and you just don't hear about that from the 60s, 70s, 50s, whatever, right? Not saying, you just don't hear about it, because again, what Vince brought to the table in pro wrestling was this comic book type of culture where guys increasingly had to look like Mr. America, right? You got guys going on the road trying to keep up their physiques. The road's a hard life as it is, and then the WWF schedule was brutal because, in the territories, they had they had kind of a route they did. And the WWF guys were crisscrossing the country. Drug use was prevalent, and a lot of these guys from the 80s, where people say, "Oh, look how much money," but what good is that money if you're destroying your body, right? What good is that, making all that money if you're destroying your body and your families in the process? This is why you see a lot of the 80s WWF wrestlers, well, not just WWF, but a lot of WWF wrestlers, their lives ended early. Their lives were bad, the drug problems, and like, what good is money at that point when your family's destroyed and your body's destroyed? Drugs and early death, like, that's such a short-sighted, materialistic view, right? And not only that, I'd rather have hundreds of guys be able to make a living out of sport than just a few guys making a bunch of money and the rest of the guys, and then it cuts down the workforce in half because there's not that many places to work, right? Now, people say, well, it was going to be inevitable that someone goes national, right? If Vince didn't do it. Now, honestly, what I think is, if Vince didn't go national, I think wrestling, eventually the territories were going to, there was going to be contraction. There was already contraction by the time Vince went national anyways. But it would have been, I think the territories, it would have had a more natural evolution, pro wrestling would have, without Vince. There would have been more natural, it would have evolved, right? But it would have been more natural evolution, not this abrupt where Vince just changes the whole face of the industry overnight. And, just imagine in those days, you had guys like Nick Bockwinkel and guys like Ray Stevens and guys that wouldn't today even be considered because they don't have that like model look of a model, or they look like these metrosexuals now you see in pro wrestling. Just like I said, pro wrestling's always had a few little pretty boys. Those were the like kind of like exceptions. But it's like pro wrestling is so generic now, right? The beauty of the territory system was guys largely developed their own gimmicks, and they did it over time, and they added little things here and there as time went on. So those gimmicks came off as more natural because it was the guy, it was an expression of the guy's creativity, the wrestlers. Where now they just slap a gimmick on somebody, and it's like they sound like actors, right? When you see pro wrestlers doing these promos, they sound like actors. They don't sound natural. Most of them, 99% of them, right? And again, wrestlers just used to have more grittier of a look and grittier of personalities back then. And then you see the abuse that went on in Vince's company. And the Vince apologists say, "Oh, well, what about the other promoters? Bring the receipts that these other promoters did anything close to what Vince did and what he's being accused of." And I mean, just so many things over the years. So he's, lives have been destroyed, and they'll say, "Well, they were adults, right?" But I mean, isn't there a concept where you're kind of, as an employer, to look out for other people? You're to look out for your employees for their best interest, right? Look how many lives have been destroyed. And I really believe Vince has the opposite of the Midas touch, where everything he comes in contact with declines, and it destroys. It gets destroyed. And I'm talking about people, because people are going to say, "Well, look at all the money." Well, if you're an empty vessel, then that's all you think about is money, and that's the most important thing, right? Money, if you're an empty vessel. But if you're not an empty vessel and you actually got a soul, you should care about people, and you should care about how you treat them and their best interests, and not just use them up, spit them out. But the thing is, what Vince did with a lot of these wrestlers, it was just malicious. Which maliciousness really is effeminate. That's an effeminate spirit. That's not manly, right? But Vince has blood on his hands. Linda McMahon does. Stephanie does. They're just not good people. I mean, they're rotten people, right? And everything they get, they deserve. Like I said, the wrestling business would have been better off without Vince. Really would have been. Really would have been. It would have evolved with or without Vince, but it would have had a more natural evolution. They eventually would use pay-per-view. But we would have had probably more healthy wrestling promotions. A product that was still closer to the grittier product it was in the territory days, but still, modernized. It's always evolved. Wrestling has, before Vince. But it was always a natural evolution, right? It was always a natural evolution. In wrestling, they would have contracted, right? Because, again, cable and all that. But, again, and then, a lot of these fans now that used to criticize Vince, and they've jumped on, now they defend Vince. He was the greatest thing since sliced bread. They say, "Oh, without Vince, wrestling would have been destroyed." That's a lie. You know how healthy wrestling was before Vince went national? 1983, the AWA had a record-breaking year with Hulk Hogan as their top babyface. World Class had their best year ever. WWF, when it was regional, had a great year, right? Mid-South was solid. They had a great year in 1984, right? Mid-Atlantic had a great year in 1983. So, wrestling was fine before Vince went national. People act like Vince saved wrestling. Wrestling didn't need saving. It was doing great. It was doing great. So, when people start they're rewriting history. They're ignoring that wrestling was making tons of money, doing great business in 1983 and in the early 80s. Even Bruno Sammartino even said when the wrestling boom, quote unquote, was happening in 1985, he did an interview and said, no, the real boom was like 79 through 83. Right? So I just think people have bought into the whole Vince thing. They've bought into him rewriting history, that he saved wrestling, that he made all these guys money. He made a few guys money. And even those few guys, look at their lives, man. I mean, look at all the lives that were ruined because of the brutal travel schedule, the drug use, steroid use. But again, in our modern society, which is soulless, that's all people talk about is how much money, 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 money. It's like they're God, right? So Vince is getting exactly what he deserves now. Don't feel bad for him at all. I mean, he's lived most of his life. And a lot of people say, oh, this is, again, the empty vessels will say, well, look, he's already 80 years old, so he's already, done a lot, lived a lot of his life, and he had all this money. I mean, if you think, you got to just look at it like this. Even his own daughter will not allow him around her children. Do you really think Vince McMahon is a happy person? The guy's not even allowed to be around his own grandchildren. You really think he's happy? And if he is happy, knowing that his own daughter, doesn't want her kids around him, then he's more of a scumbag than I thought. So this guy's not winning at life. Money doesn't make you a winner, man. In fact, I would say, a lot of people say, oh, Vince, with all this money, it made him like this. No, all this money just exposed Vince's true character. He's always been like this. He's always been a scumbag. And making all this money just gave him the power to be more of a scumbag than he already was. And it's crazy how all the pro wrestlers, all the the dirt sheet riders, they all suck Vince's balls, man. I'm serious. Like, it's pathetic. Grown men, like, you're that much of a slave. You won't dare speak a word against Vince with all this that has come out. And people who've worked for the company know what a bastard he is. It's no morals, and these people don't even work for the WWF, but they're just hoping they don't want to cross the line with Vince because they're so desperate for like one day they can make some money with the WWE or whatever. No morals, man. I thought you guys are tough guy wrestlers. Now, this is the interesting thing about the future of the business now. Because Vince ain't coming back to the WWE. That ship has sailed. Anybody thinking he's going to ever be back with the WWE is smoking something, right? Whether he'll be back involved in wrestling, trying to start another company, I mean, maybe, but the guy's super old. I really think we're in a dangerous territory with where wrestling's at. Someone I talked to in the mid-90s told me one day, because I was just bitching about Vince and wishing, I told him I hope the WWF goes out of business. I hope, they fold shop one day. And he told me be careful about that because, like them or not, and like that it or not, WWF and Vince, they carry the legacy of pro wrestling with them. They have all they have ownership of all the territory, most of the territory tapes and footage. They're the only promotion that has a link to the kayfabe era and the territory days. And we know they're not going to go out of business, right? WWE is just out of this world popular. But you have to ask yourself what Ari Emanuel, this TKO, what they're going to do with the WWE, what they're going to do with pro wrestling. And I see a dangerous thing happening. And what I see happening is them, TKO, using, because of their connection to the entertainment world and even the UFC, well, not so much UFC, I see them using celebrities as pro wrestlers. I see them turning pro wrestling I mean, was it Logan Paul? I see them just using celebrities. I just see them changing the culture of pro wrestling, where they use it just as a way to bring over celebrities to cross over and compete without paying their dues and take a lot of the top spots from the guys. I think what you're seeing now is just like, okay, they're dealing with the Vince thing. Once the fallout from that kind of subsides, yeah, you'll see more UFC guys come cross over. But see, the thing is, pro wrestling is its own thing. It's an art and craft all to its own. And what about the guys that are working their way up through these independent promotions? And I could see TKO using the Logan Pauls of the world, grabbing people from already established entertainment, whether it's sports like UFC football or the entertainment world, YouTube influencers, and bringing them over. You're seeing it in boxing already, right? Boxing has become this, they're using YouTube influencers, guys from the UFC, they're like 38, 39 years old. I mean, Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal just fought here at the Pond, which is right by me right now. Sold it out. They're 38, 39 years old, guys trying to box. And I just wonder if TKO Endeavor is going to try to remove the history of wrestling, like, not show the old tapes anymore on the Peacock network. You just wonder about that, right? You wonder, because they have no connection to the pro wrestling history. And like my friend said, like it or not, Vince and the WWF, now WWE, they're the one connection to the kayfabe era that we have. So I'm really concerned about the future of the art of pro wrestling. And it is an art. It's performance art. Because again, TKO, they have no loyalty to the sport. And I wouldn't doubt if they eventually do a rebranding. Right? If they do a rebranding. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I am concerned for the future of pro wrestling. Because the one thing about Vince, is, as much as I think he was bad for the business, is that they did pro wrestling at WWE in terms of, like, it was a wrestling business. Like, it was, they're grabbing guys from the independent promotions to become stars. I think that may change, where they just start, like, bringing in celebrities. And that's my concern. And how long Triple H stays, again, we'll see what happens. They may just keep Triple H around just until they get their bearings under. I guarantee you right now, they got people studying and doing research on how to rebrand the thing, how to totally, like, change the way they run the business, finding a guy of their liking to run it. When these companies buy other companies, they usually keep the old remnants of the old regime around for a time period, and then they eventually bring in the guys they want. If Vince would have played his cards right, this is something he could have passed down to his family owned. But again, the degeneracy of the family, Linda, the Stepford wife, she's corrupt too. Stephanie, Vince, right? The degeneracy of the family degeneracy has put them where they're at today, in a situation where the McMahon name may they become persona non grata at the company. Where it should have been their family legacy. I mean, you look at Shane, right, how young he is. He should be running the company. It should be like he should be running the day-to-day, taking over for his dad at this point. And the problem that I have with all these other promotions like NWA, AEW, just seems like they're trying to be like the WWE too much. NWA was trying to do its own thing for a while, present a more like realistic product, but then they started doing goofy stuff. It's like, don't these promotions learn? Be your own thing. Stop trying to be a cheap imitation of the WWE and what the WWE does. And let's face it, like them or love them, Vince's product was original. It was unique. I really believe there is a market for a more realistic, grittier product with grittier storylines. And when I say grittier, I'm not talking the Generation X nonsense. I'm not talking about degenerate stuff. I'm just talking about grittier, more real. I believe people like that kind of programming. And I think there's a market for that. But again, just concerned about the pro wrestling industry, and I don't think Vince overall was good for the business. I think it was awful for the business. Awful. Anyways, guys, have a good day. Have a good day.